is Dr. Priyadarshini, one of the mentors at Study Medic, and today we are going to do the RRR series on the module Embryology, which is going to target your upcoming Part 1 MRCOG exams. What you do today can improve all your tomorrows, and this video is definitely going to help you prepare better for the upcoming exams. So the first question we have today, at what gestational age does the fetal urine production begin to contribute significantly to amniotic fluid volume? Is it 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12, 16 or 20 weeks? Fetal urine is definitely one of the significant contributors to the amniotic fluid volume. But when does it start? The right answer is 16 weeks. Fetal urine production as such begins at around 10 to 12 weeks of gestation, but this becomes a significant contributor only by 16 weeks. Looking at the other options, 4 weeks is too early, the fetal kidneys are not yet functional. 8 weeks, the kidneys develop, but it's not going to start the urine production. 12 weeks, urine production starts, but it is not a significant contributor. By 20 weeks, the majority of the amniotic fluid is contributed by the urine, and this process starts by around 16 weeks. So some key points that you have to remember here. One is urine production starts at around 10 weeks. It contributes significantly to amniotic fluid by around 16 weeks. By 18 weeks, it is the primary contributor to amniotic fluid. So urinary system, we have the pronephros, mesonephros, and the metanephros. The metanephros is going to contribute to your significant development of your kidneys. Mesonephros, not really. Till the metanephros develops, we have the mesonephros helping and acting as an intermediate kidney. The pronephros forms and without any function, it just degenerates. Coming on to the second question. In the bilaminar disc stage, the amniotic cavity is located where? Is it above or below the epiblast, or is it above or below the hypoblast, or is it within the extraembryonic mesoderm? Now, in coming to the bilaminar germ disc, we need to understand it is made up of two layers. The upper layer is called as the epiblast, and the layer below that is called as the hypoblast. And this amniotic cavity is present above the epiblast. Now, below the epiblast, we have the yolk sac and we do not have the amniotic cavity. Hypoblast is a layer that is present below the epiblast, and again, it is not related to the amniotic cavity. This is a quick recap about the bilaminar disc. By around day 7, you see the blastocyst is beginning to implant, and we have the inner cell mass which is differentiated into the epiblast and the hypoblast. Now, within the epiblast and the outer layer, we have the cytotrophoblast, we have the development of the amniotic cavity. The cells that are lining are called as the amnioblast, and below we have the bilaminar disc. To be more specific, it is the epiblast layer which is present. Lower below that is the hypoblast, and below that we have the primary yolk sac that develops. Coming on to the next question, in which week of gestation do the 3 germ layers form? Is it week 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6? So it is a very, very easy question and a straightforward question. 3 germ layers is week 3, 2 germ layers is week 2. So these 3 germ layers, what are they? They are the ectoderm, endoderm and mesoderm, and this is also called as gastrulation. So week 2 is your bilaminar disc, that is your epiblast and hypoblast. By week 4, what happens? The organogenesis starts and the germ layers have already formed. By week 5, the organs are starting to develop. By week 6, we almost have the neural tube structures getting developed. This is a timeline of the early embryological changes. By day 1, we have the fertilization. By day 2 is the cleavage. By day 3 is the compaction of all the cells that have cleaved. By day 4, we have the differentiation of the cells into an inner cell mass and an outer cell mass. By day 5, there's a cavity that is formed, which is your blastocelic cavity. The inner cell mass is going to form the embryo. The outer cell mass goes on to form the placenta. Now, after cavitation, what happens? There's an important step of zona hatching where the zona cells hatch, and this is the starting of implantation. So by day 7, if you see, the implantation starts, and we have the penetration of this blastocyst into the uterine endometrial cells. If you look at the inner cell mass, it is getting differentiated into an upper epiblast and a lower hypoblast, and the bilaminar disc completes its formation by week 2. By week 3, we have the trilaminar disc formation, and it is after the trilaminar disc we have all the organogenesis starting. Next question. The appendix of the testis is a remnant of which embryological structure? We have the options of mesonephric duct, paramesonephric duct, urogenital sinus, yolk sac, and allantois. This again is a time-tested question, and the derivatives of both mesonephric and paramesonephric duct are really important to be remembered for your exams. So the right answer here is paramesonephric duct. The paramesonephric duct is also called as the Mullerian duct, and the mesonephric duct is called as the Wolffian duct. The mesonephric duct is going to form, or is this the major contributor of the male reproductive structures, and the Mullerian duct for the female reproductive structures. The urogenital sinus is a significant contributor to the development of bladder and urethra. Yolk sac is going to form the part of gut and early blood vessels, and allantois is a urachus, and it's a part of the umbilical cord. This slide is going to highlight you the derivatives of both the Wolffian duct and the Mullerian duct. If you look at the Wolffian duct, major male structures like the ductus epididymis, the vas deferens, the seminal vesicles are all formed from here. In females, it's the Gardner's duct. Not to forget, the renal pelvis, calyces, ureter, and the collecting ducts are formed in both the sexes from the Wolffian duct. Coming to Mullerian duct, if you observe carefully, it forms the female structures. The tubes, uterus, and a portion of vagina forms from the Mullerian duct. In the males, it contributes to the appendix testis and the utriculus prostaticus. The urogenital sinus gives rise to the bladder, the urethra, and the prostate in males, and some part of the caudal part of vagina in the females. Going on to the next question. The liver and gallbladder develop from which embryological structure? Is it the foregut, midgut, hindgut? Is it the mesonephric duct and the paramesonephric duct? Now, having a glance at the options that are provided to us, mesonephric and paramesonephric duct are contributors for your genitourinary system. The fore, mid, and the hindgut is the derivatives of where all your gut structures are going to be formed. The answer of the liver and gallbladder is from the foregut. The midgut forms parts of small intestine and the proximal part of colon. The hindgut forms the distal colon and the rectum. This is the differentiation of the embryological gut derivatives. We have the foregut, we have the midgut, and we have the hindgut. Foregut, the esophagus, stomach, the proximal part of duodenum, liver, pancreas, gallbladder. Midgut is for the distal part of duodenum, jejunum, ileum, cecum, appendix, ascending colon, and the proximal 2/3 of transverse colon comes from the midgut. The remaining structures up to the proximal part of anus comes from hindgut. Going on to the next question, at what gestational age does implantation of the blastocyst typically occur? We already had a walkthrough of the early embryological changes. So is it going to be day 2, 4, 6, 10, or 14? Now, each of these days carry significant changes that takes place in the early period. So implantation is seen somewhere around day 6. Now, by day 2, it is the cleavage stage. Day 4 is where the morula is getting formed. By day 10, the implantation is completely done. And by day 14, that is by 2 weeks, we have the bilaminar germ disc. So day 6 to day 7 is typically when the implantation takes place. Now, what do you mean by implantation? Implantation is basically when the blastocyst loses its outer protective layer, or that is the zona layer is lost, the zona hatching takes place, and this blastocyst is entering into the endometrial glands of the uterus. So first, what does it do? It will come and get oppose itself, and then it attaches itself to the endometrium, then it penetrates or invades itself, and then finally that is distalization and complete formation of placenta, leading to the growth of the embryo. Next question. Which of the following is not a function of the amniotic fluid? Allowing fetal movement, providing nutrient to the fetus, cushioning the fetus from trauma, maintaining a stable temperature, or prevents the adherence of the fetus to the amnion. So we know that the amniotic cavity, the amniotic fluid is definitely forming significance, a lot of significance in the fetus as well as from your exam point of view. So the right answer here is providing nutrients to the fetus. The nutrient exchange in the fetus takes place via the placenta and it is not via the amniotic fluid. All the remaining functions are key functions of the amniotic fluid. So, what are the primary functions? To provide a cushioning effect to the fetus and allow the fetus to move freely within the amniotic fluid, to have a stabilization of the temperature and protect the fetus from extreme temperature changes, to permit proper lung development of the fetus. Exchange of water and chemicals can take place between the fluid, the fetus, and the maternal circulation. However, the major nutrient contributor is from the placenta and not the amniotic fluid. It also helps with uniform development and growth of the parts of the fetus. Whenever we know there are some abnormalities in the amniotic fluid, like extra fluid of polyhydramnios, less fluid like oligohydramnios, or amniotic bands, it can lead to poor fetal growth as well as the movement of the baby can be restricted. Going on to the next question. The neural tube is formed during which week of development? We have again the options of week 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. So by now we understand week 2 is for bilaminar disc, week 3 is for trilaminar disc, and by week 4 the organogenesis starts. So by which week do we exactly find the neural tube? The answer is week 4. The neural tube forms from the neural plate and closes during week 4. Week 2 is the pre-gastrulation. Gastrulation is nothing but the formation of 3 germ layers. And the neural plate begins to form by week 3 when we have the 3 germ layers being formed. And after week 4, your organogenesis is already going on in full form. So what do you understand by neurulation and what exactly happens? First, we have something called as the primitive streak. From the primitive streak, we have the primitive node, and these are all the early developmental changes of the nervous system, or is also called as neurulation. Now, where does this form? You need to understand if we are having the 3 germ layers, the ectoderm, endoderm, and mesoderm, and these changes are observed in the ectodermal layer. So, in other words, the central nervous system develops from the ectoderm. So, by day 18, if you see, we have the neural fold that is being formed. Okay, we have the notochord, and above the notochord, we have the neural plate. Now, in all this, the neural plate is present in the ectoderm. Now, after the neural plate and the notochord is seen, what happens? There's a groove that takes place in the neural plate. We have the neural groove, and in the two sides of the neural groove, we have the neural fold. Okay. Now, after that, this neural fold completes itself, and you have the neural crest and the neural tube that develops. Around the neural crest, we have the roof plate, which again gives rise to various structures of the nervous system. Which embryological layer gives rise to the heart tube? Coming to the cardiovascular system now, does it develop from the ectoderm, mesoderm, endoderm, neural crest, or notochord? Now, we just saw the neural crest, notochord is all related to the nervous system development. We are left again with 3 options. Is it ectoderm, endoderm, or mesoderm? Basic thing we need to remember that these 3 germ layers are the definite precursors from which we have the entire organogenesis taking place. Now, out of that, let us see from where does the heart tube develop. The heart tube developed from the mesoderm. To be very specific, it is from the splanchnic mesoderm of the lateral plate. The ectoderm gives rise to the nervous system and the skin. The endoderm gives rise to the internal organs and the gut. Neural crest gives rise to your outflow tract and not the heart tube. And notochord is going to give rise to your midline structures and not the heart. So how does the heart develop? The heart, we have the 2 endocardial tubes which are present by around 20 days. By 21 days, we have the fusion of these 2 endocardial tube which gives rise to the primitive heart tube. The primitive heart tube can again be subclassified or subdivided into various structures. They are the truncus arteriosus, the bulbus cordus, the primitive ventricle, and the primitive atrium. Now, once we have the differentiation, there is a rotation to give rise to the final structure of the heart to place the ventricle and the atrium in the right position as an adult heart. So finally, it is from these 4 structures we have the various parts of the heart that develops. Next question. A single zygote that splits after 13 days post-fertilization will result in which type of twins? Is it going to be a dichorionic diamniotic? Is it going to be a monochorionic diamniotic? Is it going to be a monochorionic monoamniotic? Are they going to be conjoined twins, or is it a vanishing twin syndrome? So this is about twinning or multiple pregnancy. We need to know some very, very important points in this. You can have an image-based question on this. So you need to understand that what is the type of twinning, at what stage does the zygote splitting takes place, and how many chorions are there and how many amnions are there, which is again going to help you differentiate the types of twins. So after day 13, we are going to be conjoined twins. So splitting after day 13 is conjoined twins. They are also called as Siamese twins. So this is an explanation of the answer. We have the morula stage, and when the cleavage takes place at that stage very earlier on, it leads to dichorionic diamniotic. By dichorionic diamniotic, we need to understand that there are two different placentas that are being formed, and there are two different chorions and two different amnions. Now, when the cleavage takes place at the blastocyst stage, that is from day 4 to day 8, we have a monochorion but a diamniotic. That means the fetuses can have a shared placenta here. However, they have two different amniotic cavity. Later on, when the blastocyst is almost implanted and the cleavage takes place between day 8 but less than day 13, we have a monochorionic monoamniotic twins. That means what? There is no dividing membrane between the twins and they are present in a single cavity with a shared placenta. After that, later on, after day 13, when the cleavage takes place, it is when the organogenesis have already taken part, and this leads to conjoined twins. So you need to understand at which part of the embryo, at which stage of the embryo, and in what stage or what days that the division takes place, leading to what type of twins. This is a very, very important thing you need to remember for your exams. Going on to the next question, improper fusion of the paramesonephric duct results in which of the following conditions? Is it biconjugate twins? Is it MRKH syndrome? Is it uniconjugate twins? Is it Asherman syndrome, or is it endometriosis? Now we know that the uterus develops from the paramesonephric duct. It forms as two different tubules on both sides, comes fuses in the center where the uterus is being formed. The right answer here is the biconjugate uterus. Now, biconjugate uterus is a condition in which the fusion, the midline fusion, is not formed properly. Now, what is MRKH syndrome? In MRKH syndrome, there is a complete failure of this paramesonephric duct development. So, the uterus is generally absent, or there is agenesis of the uterus in this condition. In uniconjugate uterus, what happens? There's an incomplete development of one of the paramesonephric ducts. So one horn of the uterus is well formed, whereas the other horn is not well developed. Coming to Asherman syndrome, in this condition, there is a lot of intrauterine adhesions, and this is not a developmental defect. It is formed later on in life. It can be usually following some procedures like dilatation and curettage or vigorous curettage of the uterus, or some underlying endometritis-like condition which leads to adhesion of the uterine cavity. Coming to endometriosis, again, we understand that it is a pathological condition and it is not related to the embryological or anatomical development. So this uterine anomalies, this is the latest classification by the ESHRE on how they classify the various uterine anomalies. The clinical significance is whenever you have a uterine anomaly, this can affect the fertility of the female. So we need to understand which anomalies and how they are formed and how is it affecting the pregnancy. So this is the clinical significance behind remembering this. Coming on to the next question, it's about the bladder. The trigone of the urinary bladder develops from which embryological structure? Is it the mesonephric duct, the paramesonephric duct? Is it the urogenital sinus? Is it the allantois, or is it the cloaca? So we know the mesonephric duct, the paramesonephric duct, they are mainly contributing to the genitourinary structures. But we have other options also here, urogenital sinus, allantois, and cloaca. So the answer here is the mesonephric duct. The trigone of the bladder basically develops from the mesonephric duct, that is the Wolffian duct. So this is going to integrate into the bladder during development. The urothelium that covers it later get replaced by the endodermal lining of the urogenital from the urogenital sinus. Paramesonephric duct mainly contributing to the female genital structures. The urogenital sinus forms most of the bladder and the urethra. But remember, trigone is still from the mesonephric duct. Allantois is going to form your urachus, and which later on becomes the median umbilical ligament. Cloaca, it is from the cloaca where you have the urogenital sinus getting divided and also the rectum, but directly it does not form the trigone of the bladder. So the bladder development, urogenital sinus forms most of the bladder. Urogenital sinus is again a derivative, or it divides from the cloaca. However, trigone is from the mesonephric duct. So some important points to remember about the overview of trigone development. It is the trigone is present in the posterior wall of the bladder, and this develops from the mesonephric duct. But the urothelium forms from the endoderms of the urogenital sinus. So initially, to start on, the trigone is covered from the epithelium of the mesonephric duct. Later on, it gets replaced from the endodermal urogenital sinus. So urinary bladder, it develops mainly from the vesical part of the urogenital sinus. Trigone is developed from the mesonephric duct. The epithelium is endodermal in origin, and this endoderm is from the urogenital sinus. All the other layers of the bladder are formed the splanchnic mesoderm. Going on to the next question. The ductus venosus plays which role in fetal circulation? So fetal circulation has three important shunts to be remembered, which gets replaced or which are not present in the adult circulation. And one important among them is the ductus venosus. So what is the role of it? Let's look at the option. Does it going to shunt blood from the umbilical vein to the inferior vena cava, or shunt blood from the right atrium to the left atrium, shunt blood from the pulmonary artery to the aorta, or is it a connection between the right atrium and the right ventricle, or does it become later on the ligamentum arteriosum after delivery? So ductus venosus, if you see, is shunting blood from the umbilical vein to the inferior vena cava. It is in fact the first shunt the bloods from the umbilical vein is going to encounter. So what does the ductus venosus do? We know the umbilical vein carries the oxygenated blood from the placenta towards the fetus. So as it enters, it has to bypass the liver, and we want the oxygenated blood reaching the heart and from there going to the other peripheries of the fetus. So it is ductus venosus which helps in redirecting this oxygenated blood and bypassing the liver, and it's going to direct it directly into the inferior vena cava. The connection between the right and the left atrium is nothing but the foramen ovale. The connection between the pulmonary artery and the aorta is nothing but the ductus arteriosus. The ductus arteriosus becomes later on the ligamentum arteriosum, and the ductus venosus becomes later on the ligamentum venosum. And the foramen ovale closes to become the fossa ovalis. The connection between the right atrium and the right ventricle is in the normal cardiac flow. So this is about the fetal shunts. We need to understand the placenta brings in the oxygenated blood. It reaches the ductus venosus, which shunts and bypasses the hepatic circulation. It shunts it into the inferior vena cava. Then the oxygenated blood, preferential oxygenated blood, reaches the right atrium. From the right atrium, we do not want the blood to go into the right ventricle because we know the lungs are not functional in the fetus. So again, it's a preferential shunting of this blood from the right atrium to the left atrium via the foramen ovale. After the left atrium, we know the blood enters into the left ventricle, and from the left ventricle, it goes into the aorta. However, there is some minimum amount of blood which has gone into the right atrium. From the right atrium, it goes to the right ventricle, and from right ventricle, it goes to the pulmonary circulation. So that blood again gets shunted back into the aorta via the ductus arteriosus. So in this way, what happens? Most of the oxygenated blood reaches the peripheries of the fetus, and there is good oxygenation to the entire body of fetus. Going on to the next question, how many vessels are present in the normal umbilical cord? Does the umbilical cord have one artery and one vein, two artery and one vein, two vein and one artery, 2 artery, 2 vein, or is it 3 artery and 1 vein? Do not get confused with these numbers. This is a very, very important thing about umbilical cord. You can also have an image-based question on the cut section of the umbilical cord. The umbilical cord has 2 arteries and 1 vein. Okay, the 2 arteries are going to carry the deoxygenated blood. It is this one big vein that is going to carry the oxygenated blood to the fetus. So oxygenated blood, umbilical vein, single. Deoxygenated blood, 2 arteries, both the right and left are present. And this carries the deoxygenated blood. So we have the Wharton's jelly, and within the Wharton's jelly, we have the one large structure that we can encounter, that is the umbilical vein. The 2 small structures that we see are the 2 umbilical arteries. The left vein is left behind and the right vein disappears. Going on to the next question, we have about human chorionic gonadotropin. Now, this is the important hormone of early pregnancy, and this is first produced by which structure? Is it the morula? Is it the cytotrophoblast? Is it the syncytial trophoblast? Is it the inner cell mass, or is it the blastocele? We know that HCG is important, but where is it first produced? It is produced from the syncytial trophoblast. It starts producing HCG shortly after implantation, and this is going to maintain the corpus luteum and the pregnancy. The other structures do not form the HCG. Cytotrophoblast, it contributes to the trophoblastic development. That is, it contributes significantly to the development of the placenta, but it is not going to secrete your HCG hormone. So HCG, other important points to remember, we have the alpha and the beta subunit. The alpha subunit of the human chorionic gonadotropin is having a common structure with other hormones like LH, FSH, and TSH, whereas the beta subunit is very, very specific to HCG. If you look at the embryonic cells, we have the syncytial trophoblast, which forms your HCG, and this is very, very important to maintain early pregnancy and the corpus luteum, because the corpus luteum is the one that's going to produce progesterone and help in development of your early pregnancy. So today we have discussed almost 15 questions, very, very important questions, recalls from your previous papers on the module embryology. I hope this video is very useful for your preparations. Do like and subscribe. We have almost 100K subscribers for us on YouTube, and this is significantly going to enhance your preparation for your exam, and all the best for your upcoming Part 1 MRCOG examinations. Thank you, and wishing you all the very best from Team Study Medic.